Okay, so good morning and Shavua Tov. And uh, one of you asked me earlier if we can say Yeshehiyanu. So you know that in Halacha it says that if you didn't see a friend for 30 days and then you see him, then you can say the Shehechiyanu. Poskim nowadays say that because we have phones and we have ways to see each other even remotely, and we can hear about each other, so they are hesitant about making the bracha. But at least without mentioning Shem u'malchut, we can say שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה. And it's really wonderful to be here back. And as Michael mentioned earlier, we continue the same series of shiurim, which is dedicated לעילוי נשמת רפאל משה ben Eliyahu, זיכרונו לברכה. And I was thinking for a week, should we just continue where we stopped, or should I change the topic? Should I speak about something else? And I really couldn't make my mind till yesterday night, Motzei Shabbos. Uh, and on Motzei Shabbat, I thought that we should continue, and that is because in the end, the place where we find ourselves now in the present is a consequence and a continuation of our history. And even when you cannot, I mean, there is no direct line between Reb David Tzvi Hoffman, about whom you are going to speak, and what is on the headlines of the newspapers this morning, because he lived a very different life. However, I think that if we look deeper, not only at the headlines, but on the content and on the thoughts and on the ideologies and the faith that we are being led by, then it is clear that the lives of our great rabbanim of the last generation, the generation before, can be lights that would lead our way in our situation, with all the differences, even with all the differences being taken into account. So after all of that, I decided in favor of just continuing the series from where we were standing. And I would like to speak today about Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, which is a very important and interesting figure, which unfortunately I think is not known as he should be, and that is part of the general disappearance in many senses of the Yekish Orthodox Judaism, about which we already spoke a few times. We spoke about Rashar Hirsch, when you spoke about Rabbi Ilzheimer. So Reb David Tzvi Hoffman is, in some sense, you know, they say that everything requires luck. הכל תלוי במזל, אפילו ספר תורה שבהיכל. Right? So sometimes even the question what would be published and what not, what would become famous and what not, depends on skill, depends on depth, but also depends on being in the right place in the right time. And for many reasons, and of course, the Holocaust, the Shoah is not the least one of them, being a rabbi in Germany of the 19th century would not necessarily make you very much known in next generations in the Batei Midrash, in the yeshivot. However, it's very interesting that in the world of research, in the world of Mada'ei HaYahadut, Judaism, I guess scientific science, Judaism science, the science of Torah learning in universities, they sometimes know the names of the German Jews better than they are known in the yeshivot, and that is part of what we are going to speak about today. So this is Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman. He was born in 1843, in a place that was called Verbo, and it was part of Hungary, which was back then the Hungarian Austrian Empire. And today it's called Verbova, and it's in Slovakia. And that's part of the general history of Europe, that in order to know which place belong where, you need to be an expert and in what time. So it was back then in Hungary, but we have to understand that it was very much affected. It was what was called by the Jews. Hungary was called, part of it was called the Uberland and the Unterland. So Verbo was part of what was called the Uberland. Now, why it is important? Because I think that most of us, when we speak about Hungarian Jews, then what we have in our head, in our mind, is Munkacs or Satmer. And that is very much correct. That is what is called the Unterland. These was affected by Hasidism, and they were, you may say that ultra-Orthodox in many senses grew up there. So Hungarian Jews were known for being very strict. However, the Unterland is a different story. Now, they were also, in many places, they were very Orthodox, but they were not Hasidic at all. This is the Khatam Sofer land. And there they were affected by, I mean, the high culture many times was German in these type of places. And so they were affected by the same, we may say, spirit that affected the Ashkenazic, the real Ashkenazic Jews in Germany. And so that is the Uberland. And he was born there. So that's just some general background. So you'd understand how he became to be, who he became to be while he was growing up in Hungary. So he was born to his father, which was the Dayan or the rabbi of this small place of Verbo. It was called Rav Moshe Yuda. The name of his mother was Chirale or Chirle. Now, his father passed away, was niftar, when he was 5 years old. So he was growing up as an orphan. However, he had, again, the good luck, you may say, of being born to the son of the city's rabbi. So he was, in a sense, he was more supported, and he was a great Ilui. He was extremely genius, and he had an extremely good memory. So everything that he read, he remembered, and he began to write. He began to write chidushim, his thoughts on the Shas, at the age of 7. And so, meaning sometimes you have this type of stories, but here it is supported by evidence because we are already in the 19th century. So we have people that testify. It's very, very interesting. So he was a prodigy. He was a great genius. So they sent him to yeshivot. He was moving from yeshiva to yeshiva. However, as I said, because of the place he was growing up in, he was also exposed to limudei chol, to secular studies, what would be called today English. Obviously, nothing there was English, but he was exposed to secular studies to whatever extent in the 19th century was seen as the edge of secular studies in these times and places. So he's also being educated as I said, in science. Again, science, but in whatever was called science back then, but science. In the age of 14, so we speak about the year 1857, he is being sent to the yeshiva of the Maharam Shik, Rav Moshe Shik. Rav Moshe Shik was a student of the Khatam Sofer. We had a shiur about him. Also a very interesting figure. Again, I apologize for using this broad terms, but a very right-wing figure, extremely right-wing figure on one hand, but on the other hand, as a student of the Khatam Sofer, he also knew how to enable students of his that he saw that are able to also learn limudei chol secular studies. He would allow that. He did not oppose, at least not vehemently. So if someone, meaning in these areas, the policy was, we do not ask and you do not tell. So if you go to some gymnasium in the afternoon, but you are, all of your duties you are fulfilling, and we see you in all of the tefillot, and we see you in the sdarim of the yeshiva, and there would be a test. every week to everyone. That was the way that it worked in Hungary. So there would be tests, and you would be exempt every week, and you would know everything you should know. Then if you disappear for 2 hours a day, no question would be asked. And that is how he continued his studies. And he saw he learned by the Maramshik. I think it is incorrect to say that Maramshik became his main rabbi. His main rabbi would be Rabbi Azriel Hildesheimer. But nonetheless, it is obvious that he took from there, he knew how to learn. I want to explain why do I emphasize that, because as we understand, he would very soon, he would find himself in Germany. Now, in the time that we speak about now, meaning in the mid-19th century, the old yeshiva, the old Ashkenazic yeshiva that survived from the time of the Baalei HaTosfot for the 12th century, all of these were closing down. This was the end of them. Why? Because German Jews were not interested anymore in learning so many hours of Talmud. They were interested in acculturating themselves into the leading culture of the time, which is obviously German culture. That is the highest form of culture that can be achieved. Everyone's sure that was clear. The only thing that I can compare it, and maybe some of you would be able to identify, is the passion of Jews in America in the beginning of the 20th century to become acculturated. I'm not speaking about Jews that wanted to assimilate, but even Jews that wanted to remain Jewish. But it was clear to them, we'll speak about that, I hope so, as we continue the show, that you should learn in a public school. Of course you should learn in a public school. You should not differentiate yourself from, right? I guess that some of you know it from your own families. It was almost a heresy to say that you need a special Jewish school. Why should we have a special Jewish school? We want to become, we are citizens. And it was extremely important for the German Jews. I imagine that most of us grew in a very different environment. And even if you grew up in Chutz La'aretz, it was already a different environment. And maybe it is difficult for us to wrap our head and understand the way that these Jews thought. But it was really the zeitgeist that we want to be part of the world and being part of this enlightenment, which is the time, meaning we are already 100 years later, but being part of this enlightened world requires that you would learn in the enlightened institutions, which are the public school and the high schools, and of course, college. And so in Germany, yeshivot were closing down, they were already non-existent. And reform was not only raising its head, they were almost in control of all the big Jewish communities. And when we speak about reform, this is reform German style. So in Hungary, they also had some type of a reform that was in comparison to what was happening in Germany. In Hungary, they were doing it very, very slowly. They were more conservative. No, they were not. Do not confuse it with the conservative movement that developed later in the United States. But they were more conservative reform, and these were called the neologim. But in Germany, reform was real reform. Everything would be thrown out. Shabbat is out. Torah is out. Almost everything is out. What remains is what can be koshered in the standards of Protestants. If a Protestant priest would come in and would be happy what he sees in shul, that means that the shul is good. I hope that I do not exaggerate, but I don't think I exaggerate. So everything that would seem too Jewish is to be cut out. That is what was happening in Germany in many of the communities. And as we can imagine, that itself can only hold for one generation, because the next generation asks himself, so why should they stay Jewish? Right? If everything that is Jewish is out of the window, and what we are remaining with is some type of a parv thing which is not offending anyone and not saying anything and just be nice. Okay, I can be nice without being quoted in universities and without being having to pay a special tax and without being signed in society as different, and I would be able to marry whoever I want. So why not to become part of general society? And that was what was happening in Germany of the time. And so even the Orthodox, because yeshivot were closing down, so, and again, I hope to speak about it later, but even the Orthodox were they were strong in keeping halacha as they understood it, and they were fighting for it. But learning Torah, learning halacha, learning Talmud, they were not known for it. There was even the great people that we speak about in Germany of the time, the Rabbanim of the time, were not necessarily known for their Talmudic expertise. That was something that was developed in Eastern and Central Europe, mostly in Eastern Europe of the time. But here we speak about someone that learned in the greatest yeshivot of the Khatam Sofer, his student, the Maharam Shik. Later he would also learn in the yeshiva of the son of the Khatam Sofer, the Ktav Sofer, in Pressburg, and that's the great yeshiva of Pressburg. And he learned there for 2 years. However, it seems from his biography that the real reason that he left the Maharam Shik and came to there was because in Pressburg there was a college. And so he was able to begin his learning, his limudei chol. However, he was very stuck in the yeshiva. That is not a question. He was a genius. Everyone saw that he would be a great rabbi in the next generation. In 1860, so he's 17, and he goes to Eisenstadt. And in Eisenstadt, at the time, there is Rav Azriel Hilzheimer, and when it would come to Berlin, it would become the seminar for rabbis, a seminar לרבנים, or the Beit Midrash for Rabbanim. And it is not in Berlin yet, as you can understand, it's in Eisenstadt. And what Rav Alzheimer is trying to do, he says, we have a problem. Science is leaping forward, and we are now, we are seen by others, which is not as bad, but by our children as backward. So what we need to do is to bridge this gap. We need to learn Torah in a scientific way. We need to also understand science. We need our Rabbanim to become educated in universities also, so they would be able to answer the needs of the new generation. So that was what Rav Hilzheimer was in favor of. Now, I would speak later in what ways it is similar to what Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was teaching, and in what ways it was also very different from Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. However, Rav Hilzheimer Eisenstadt was teaching according to these ways, meaning that we need to be great in Torah, but we also need to learn science, and we need to combine Torah and science in order to develop the skills needed for this new world which is ushering upon us. Rav David Zvi Hoffman learned there for 3 years and got his smicha from, so when he was 20, he got his smicha from Rav Hilzheimer, and he would see Rav Hilzheimer as his rabbi for the rest of his life. However, Rav Hilzheimer himself couldn't remain in Eisenstadt because that was still Hungarian area, and Hungarian Jews, even in the Oberland, where I said they were more open, they were not open to something like what Rav Hilzheimer was teaching, which was to learn Torah in a scientific way. That seemed to them as too much of a separation from the tradition, the Mesorah of how Torah should be learned. And he was being attacked from left and right. And that's always what happens to this type of figures, which are trying to combine, because the left would attack them because they are not enough leftists, and the right would attack them because they are not enough to the right. So they find themselves, he found himself attacked from both sides, and he understands that he needs to go to a place in which he would be able to carry out his plans, and he leaves to Germany. So he is right now out of the picture, and Rav Ilzheimer is looking for a job because he needs to support his mother. You remember that his mother remained a widow because his father died in a young age, and now she needs her son to support her. So he is taking a teaching position in a place in Hochberg near Würzburg. Now, why is that important? Because here is going to meet with the second great authority of the German Jews of the time. We already spoke about Rav Hilzheimer, which was in favor of Torah Imada, we may say. And now he's meeting in Würzburg with the Würzburg Rav. Who was the Würzburg Rav? That is Rav Seligman Ber, meaning Rav Dov in Hebrew, Rav Seligman Ber Bamberger. Now, Rav Bamberger was the last of his kind, meaning he was still educated in the old yeshivot of Ashkenaz before they were closed. And he was opposing Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in a very known pulmus. How do I say pulmus? Yeah, back and forth between them about the question of separation of the communities. Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch believed that because Reform took over of the old communities, of the Kehila, all the institutions of the Kehilot were taken over by Reform, you have no other choice but to separate yourself. And you have to remember, in Germany of the time, here, what does it mean to separate yourself? You can open whatever shul you want and you'd have another shul. But in Germany, you had to be a member of a community. It is part of the legal system. You cannot just be an atom in the vacuum, right? You must be a member, a paying member of the community. And Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch said, we are not allowed to pay to the institution of the Reform community. So we have to declare ourselves as a new religion. I mean, he wanted them to be declared as a new religion, but that was more difficult. So in the end, he was able to convince the German government to separate between two completely different religions. One was the religion of the Reform Judaism, and the other was his own Judaism, meaning what we would call later Orthodox Judaism. And he had to establish a whole new kehila, not only a shul, everything, and a complete separation from the Reform. Again, we would call them today Orthodox. The whole thing obviously is completely anachronistic. But many God-fearing Jews and practicing Jews did not agree with the step of separating the communities because they said Achdut Israel, the unity of Am Israel, is extremely important.
Did the Reform to take over the whole of the
Yes, that is because they were the majority. That is because when you are not able to educate your children to continue your way, then they would do what they want to do. And in the end, what happened in Germany, again, that is my opinion. Obviously, it's not that anything that I got in prophecy, but it was a major failure in the end, it's a major failure in chinuch. Everything comes down to that. And again, I would speak about that. I hope that I would speak about that as I would speak about Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman. And the same thing more or less happened in the United States, right? So many, again, Orthodox, they are not called Orthodox, but practicing Jews came to the United States. In one generation or two, there were many shuls in many places. And in one generation, all of them all completely got out of the fold, out of religion, or if they stayed Jews,
the benefit because it was
if they at least stay Jews, but they were not practicing anymore. Why? And it was more convenient to them to join either the conservative or the Reform, and that's it.
Interesting. That's so in the UK and South Africa, where non-practicing Jews prefer to belong to an Orthodox community.
It's very difficult for me I don't have enough historical knowledge to understand what the difference is. I would imagine that in England, the surrounding environment was also more, again, conservative, small c. So reform would less take hold in places in which the general environment is less in favor of great changes. But in places like the United States, in which the new is the king, then it would make a lot of sense to completely throw everything. And Germany of the time was the same. It was a cutting edge, leading, advancing. So people were very eager to throw the old and join the new. It also happened, but the Catholics were having the same problems in a sense. And that is because people were leaving faith. Science is the new king, and you are joining it. And if you're not able to give your children, so either you are being very high walls, which can work or not work, or you should give your children the weapons in which to fight these Cohens. Now, the parents, it's not that they don't want to give their children the weapons, but they didn't have them. And it took time to develop them. And until they were developed, you lost most of the war, which again happened also in the United States. Why do we now, Baruch Hashem, now the Orthodox community in the United States is thriving, and they found the ways to continue Torah education to the next generation in a place like America. But it is after we lost, what, 80%. So we have to understand where we are standing. So it's a success, but it's success that cost. I mean, it's after many failures. So that was also happening in Germany. So again, so when he was teaching in Hochberg near Würzburg, he became a friend of the Würzburg Rav, and he also learned from him. So Rav Bamberger was a great opponent of separating the communities. He was in favor of old traditional Judaism. Everyone is together, and you have tzibur, tzaddikim, beinonim, reshaim, some practicing, some are not practicing, and you should manage yourself within this game field. Now, again, was it possible? It's a question that it's not for me to answer. It's for the people there to answer. I mean, it's easy for us to speak about the importance of unity, etc.
No, another 10 minutes.
But back then, when you were, what would you do if the shul is not davening in the right way? And you're not allowed to establish a new shul, and you cannot have funds for a new shul unless you separate the communities. That's not an easy question. What you do if you do not have a kosher mikveh, and you cannot use the funds of the community to build the kosher? Now, we can say, find someone to support, and maybe you will. But if not, then what do you do? And I'm not speaking about the education of children. Who are the teachers brought in? Who is the Rav being brought in by the community? So it's very, very difficult and complicated situation, which for us, 100 years later, I think it would not, more than 100 years later, it would not be appropriate to judge. And Reb Shimshon Raphael had his own ideas, and the Würzburg Rav Bamberger had his own ideas. And Rav Yitzheimer himself, by the way, to my understanding, never gave a concrete answer to the question of the separation of communities. I mean, he tried not to get himself involved into that. As I said, his idea was not to separate the communities or not to separate the communities. He said we should approach the problem by solving the root. The root is the question of science against religion. And if we would be able to prove, not only to demonstrate, that not only that science and religion do not contradict, but that they support each other, then you'd not have the whole problem of reform and separating communities, etc., etc., etc. That was his idea. Okay, so he becomes a friend of Bamberger, and later he leaves Hochberg because he wants to complete his PhD. So he goes to Vienna, to Berlin. In the end, he gets his doctorate from a university called Tübingen, which is a very old university in Germany. And he writes his doctorate about Rav Shmuel. Shmuel was one of the great Amoraim of the Talmud Bavli. And he is writing his PhD on him. He's called, being again, I cannot repeat the German, of course, but in English they translate that as Shmuel, the dean of the rabbinical academy in Bavel. So the dean of the, obviously that is the way, I have to say, Rosh Yeshiva in English. So it is interesting to me. I think the doctorate was published in English. I am not sure if it was published in Hebrew. I don't know. I didn't check. It would be interesting, I guess, to read it. It would also be interesting for me to know who was his guiding professor to write the doctorate. I don't know. I would guess that maybe he was guiding himself. Anyhow, he got his doctorate, he got his PhD, which didn't help him, by the way, to get citizenship from the German government. They never gave him to the end of his life because, you know, the German government was the German government. So they were more anti-Semitic, less anti-Semitic, but philo-Semitic they were never. And even such an outstanding scholar that would teach later and would be revered by everyone, he asked many times to become a German citizen. You can imagine that he fulfilled all of his citizenship duties and he paid taxes, never helped him. Anyway, so he got his PhD. And in 1872, which would make him 29, he got married. Now he got married with a daughter of one of the old Yekish families, which were still very, very poor. And it led him into troubles later, as I would explain. However, his wife was extremely wise. There are many stories that later in his life, he became a very, very busy rabbi. And when a woman would come in with a chicken, they say he sent them to his wife, and his wife would give the psika on the chicken. And only if his wife was not able to see the hater, then if she was being matir, he relied on her 100%. If she couldn't find a way to be lenient, then the wife came into his room and they checked the chicken together. And they say that sometimes they will argue about the chicken, and many times she would be right, and he would. So it's an interesting story. It's a relationship. Okay. So that was when he got married. Again, it's interesting. 29 is a somewhat older age, especially when you speak about rabbinical biographies. But I guess that's part, again, of the spirit of the age and him being in need to go from place to place to finish his PhD and to support his mother. So it took some time. In the same year that he got his doctorate, in 1871, in the same year that he got married, in 1872, he also becomes a teacher in the school, in the day school of the third great authority in Germany. We spoke about Rabbi Ilzheimer, we spoke about Rav Bamberger. The third one was, of course, Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch established a school, a day school. He understood that the problem is chinuch. And so he was one of the first ones to establish a day school in all of Europe, but in Germany, a Jewish day school. And the children would learn there. There was sometimes it was an elementary school. He wanted also to have a high school. There were many problems. Also, the German government was always interfering with the subject matter. And they were always trying to push more limudei chol, more secular studies, because the children are just wasting their time with all of his Talmud and things. And in the end, Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch himself, again, it's very difficult to know what did he want. But it seems that he wanted something like 60-40. 60% limudei kodesh, 40% limudei chol, something like that. In the end, it was more like 10-90. But that was because of the German government, not in the life of Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, but in the next generation. But they were always fighting. So Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch invited Reb David Tzvi Hoffman, which had a PhD, but also was a genius in Talmud. So this is the man he wants as a model for his students. So he invited him to teach in his school. We have a very interesting story that Rav Hoffman relates to later when he publishes a responsa called Melamed Le'oil. That is in the first source in your source sheet. Let's see. Okay, and the question is, היא רשאי להישבע בערכאות שלהם בגילוי ראש. Are you allowed to take an oath in a secular court without a kippah, without a yarmulke on your head? That is the question, because you are taking an oath in the name of God. So every religious activity you should have, at least presumably, you should have a head cover. So are you allowed to take, but on the other hand, in the secular court, it is seen as barbaric to go with a hat. It's in the Western world, it's the nimus, right? The manners are that you are taking your hat off as a sign of respect, which is completely opposed, I guess, to, I don't know if to the Eastern world, at least to our senses, in which putting a head cover is a way of showing respect. Right? That's a difference. So we can speak about the reasons for the difference, but that's not our topic today. So the question is, are you allowed to take an oath in secular court without a head cover? And the answer is, אין לי פנאי להאריך כעת. I don't have the time to write at length, but he says you can look at a source, the מקל בשעת הדחק, that in a place of need you are allowed. Let's skip a few. It's all very, very interesting, but I'm skipping about in the middle. הנה בקהילת קודש יראים בפפדם. Frankfurt, right? Papdam is Frankfurt on the Main. So in Papdam, בבית החינוך, in the school, שנתייסד מהגאון רב שמשון רפאל הירש זצ"ל. So the school that was established by the genius, the Gaon, Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch Zatzal, and he says, I was a teacher there for 2.5 years. יושבים התלמידים בשעת לימוד שאר המדעים בפריעת ראש. He says, when in the school of Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, when they were learning Torah, they would have a yarmulke. But when they were learning other subjects, they would sit without a head cover. ורק בשעת לימוד תורה מכסים ראשם, וכן הוא המנהג בבית ספר בהמבורג, he says the same thing goes in Hamburg, וזה נעשה על פי תקנת הרב הגאון, מורנו ורבינו, הרב שמשון רפאל הירש זצ"ל. So that's not by accident. That is how Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch wanted things to happen. Extremely interesting. And it has a story. בפעם ראשון שבאתי לביתו של הרב הגאון שמשון רפאל הירש בכובע ראשי. So the first time I entered the house of Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and it seems that he went to his office. He says, I went with my hat. Why? Again, because that's the mechubad way, is to go with your hat on. Right? You can see, look, go to a more Haredi shul, you'd see that they daven with the hats. Putting the hat on is seen as a sign of respect. And he says, but Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch said, אמר לי שכאן הוא דרך ארץ להסיר הכובע מעל הראש כשבאים אל אדם חשוב. Amazing. Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch sees Reb David Zvi Hoffman, this Eastern Juden, right? This Jew from Hungary, coming into his house with the hat on his head, and he feels, I guess, the need to educate him in the manners of Germany. And he says to him, you know, when you entered an important man, then you need to take your hat off as a sign of respect. Now, just to understand, there is not that you take your hat off and there will be a kippah underneath. You're taking your hat off and that's it. So Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch told him to take off his hat when speaking with him. Now, what was the reason that he gave? אולי יראה מורה אחר, maybe another teacher would see, because in the school there are many morim אינם יהודים, that are non-Jews, שאני איני מסיר הכובע מעל הראש לפני ראש בית החינוך, the director, היה מחשיב זה כאילו אני מבזה אותו. So if a non-Jew would see that you are speaking with me, says Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch to David Zvi Hoffman, if one of the non-Jewish teachers would see you speaking with me with a hat on your head, that would be a sign of disrespect. So in the culture in which we are, we need to follow the rules of manners, and that would mean to go without a hat while you learn secular studies. not only when you meet Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, when you learn secular studies. This is, I think, a very telling story. It tells us the story of both sides. Because Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and I think that's very important, Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, he understood that in order to keep the children, the young generation, in the fold, in the field, in the way, in the derech, you need to have Torah im derech eretz. He understood derech eretz to be manners, culture, work, obviously. That was how he saw derech eretz. But he wanted to have that, in a sense, separated. While you are learning Torah, you wear your hat. But you should understand, the Torah is what was given to Moshe Sinai. But if you are learning secular studies, I would now say something that is not written here, but I think it's stemming from here. Take off your hat, because you have to understand the difference between secular and religious. And what relates to manners is secular, and what relates to halacha and to your religious life is religious. Now it worked, to a degree at least. But it was not the way that Rav David Tzvi Hoffman saw that, because it's not the way that Rav Azriel Hitzheimer, his main Rebbe, saw it. They thought that you need to combine science and Torah. You should have your hat on when you learn science, because learning scientifically is part of Torah. So that's a big difference here, which, again, both of them supported this idea of Torah im derech eretz. Both of them supported the idea of being open to general society, but remaining very strong on your Jewish identity. But in different ways that would be subtle to someone from Munkach. Both are treif. It doesn't matter if you learn your secular studies with a hat, without a hat, and that's like putting a hat on a treif animal. It doesn't help. But in Germany itself, these were differences of opinions and of approaches, which in a sense we can also identify in our times. In our times, I think that in no school they will tell you take off your kippah while learning the secular studies, but there is still a difference. Do you see them as completely separate, or do you try to infuse from one to the other? That's a great question. You can have your Yarmulke on or off. That is not really what is important. But the question is, do you use your Torah on your secular studies? And no less important, do you use scientific methods while you learn Torah? Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, 2 years later, someone from the family of Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, you remember, he was married into a very strong, frum, Yekish family. Someone would go to Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and ask him, did you read the doctorate that your teacher in your school wrote? And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch would say, no, I didn't, and would read it. And he would write a very strong critique of the doctorate of Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, to the extent that he would write that according to his opinion, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman is not prepared yet to publish things publicly, and he should refrain from writing for the next 5 years. As you can understand, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman was greatly injured because he did appreciate, everyone in Germany appreciated Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. So he was offended, and he wrote a letter to his rabbi, to Rav Azriel Hitzheimer. He also wrote, by the way, to another friend, Rav Nathan Adler in England, who was also very strong in Jewish and science. And he received from both of them haskamot, right, agreements to his doctorate, and told them, no, you should not refrain from writing, continue to write. But as you can understand, he didn't remain in the school of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. He would respect him to the end of his life. Even in the tshuva that we just wrote, he writes about him in a very kavodic manner. The gown, Zatzal. So chas v'chela, and that was part of his personality, was very humble. Everyone that writes about him says he was extremely humble. But even if you're extremely humble, you cannot remain in a school in which the director, right, which the head of the school wrote about you and published it, that you are not allowed to write for the next 5 years. I mean, that's impossible. So it took. Excuse me?
What was so controversial about it?
The even for Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the attempt to use scientific means on Torah was pasul to begin with. He was extremely against it. Learning Jewish subject in a historical manner is pasul, because we need to. Torah is the way that we learn by our tradition. Now again, Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch himself had a very unique ideas about what our Mesorah is. So his Perush is not necessarily the Perush that would be done. I mean, if you read the Perush of Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, it is not necessarily similar to what would happen in the Perushim that would be written in the same time in Eastern Europe. But at least he believed very strongly that he is completely separating the way that he's learning Torah from the culture of the time. He writes about it. He is even criticizing, we spoke about Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, but I think it's important to emphasize it again. He even criticizing no other than the Rambam for bringing philosophy into Judaism. He says that was a mistake, because Judaism has to be learned from within and not from without. And to this day, I think that there would be many rabbis, I knew some of them, great people, that had no problems with learning general studies, but they would be extremely opposed to using scientific methods on Jewish subjects. Because when you are learning Torah, it should be done in the way of Mesorah. And bringing the tools of critique into the field of Torah, that is, or a shatnez, right? Adding two things that cannot really be combined, or worse than that. That's how Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch saw the whole project. And so even without, it's not what can Reb David Tzvi Hoffman write that would be so controversial in a doctorate about Shmuel. But even the attempt to date some of the Mishnayot, even that for Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch should be a red flag, because for him everything that is Torah is eternal, and the attempt to historicize it is pasul to begin with. Yes, in truth, yes. So if you'd ask me, but didn't he know that? I have no answer. I guess that as long as he could keep a blind eye, he kept. But when someone pushed him, he had no other choice but to say his opinion. So Reb David Tzvi Hoffman is leaving the school of Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and we are ending the shiur. It's 3 minutes to 10, and we didn't even spoke about. So I guess that we'll have to continue next week. But however, here an opportunity presented himself, because as I said, Rav Hilzheimer was looking for a new place to open his rabbinical seminary, not a yeshiva, a rabbinical seminary, and he opens it in Berlin. And he is inviting his brilliant student, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, to join him as the teacher. So he would teach the high class, and Rav David Tzvi Hoffman would teach the beginners. And Rav David Tzvi Hoffman obviously is jumping on this opportunity. Can you say jumping on the opportunity? Yeah. Okay. He's jumping on this opportunity, and he is taking it with both hands, because he would be paid by the institution, so it's a good salary. He'd be able to support himself. He had, if I remember correctly, he had 15 children. 10 of them survived. I mean, that's the time. 10 of them survived. I think that these are the numbers. So he'd be able to support himself. Yeah, this is the wife that was checking chicken. I guess that she was a real Eshet Chayil. She was a real Eshet Chayil. Yeah, and I would give you the exact number, Bezrat Hashem, next week. Yeah, she survived him. I think that maybe it was more. So I would give you the exact number, but you have to remember, unfortunately, many babies would die in their first year. So from 15, 10 survived. That's a very harsh yet. It's a lot, but it's just think about it. To give a I mean, that's I don't have to tell you. It's a tragedy, but that was the numbers back then. these were just the numbers. Even in Berlin, he was living in places in which the health was good, but just that's what was happening. So he left Reb Shimshon Raphaelish and he came to the seminary, rabbinical seminary in Berlin. Now there he taught, it's unbelievable. He taught the whole gamut, meaning he taught Talmud, obviously. He taught Halacha. He taught Mishnah. Okay, that's great. But then he also taught almost all of the secular subjects. So he taught Latin and geography and Semitic languages. So because he was a genius, and almost everything he learned, he remembered, and almost everything that he learned, he had what to add. So he wrote hundreds of articles, unfortunately, all of them in German, and most of them were never translated. So if someone would ever want to take, I don't know what is a scientific contribution of them today. I have no idea. But some of works that he had done and were translated are used to this day, about which we would, Be'ezrat Hashem, learn next time. However, although he was extremely busy in the rabbinical seminary teaching all of these students, he also had a promise he made to his father-in-law. You remember that, again, the family of his wife was a very firm family. And I guess that his father-in-law, when they got married, he saw that the son-in-law is very modern. So he made him promise that he would also learn Gemara like a simple Jew every day. And Reb David Tzvi Hoffman he was an Hungarian Jew, but he was really Yekish in his neshama. If he made a promise, he would keep it to the grave. So although he was teaching, I don't know, like three positions, 300% in the rabbinical seminary, he understood that the way that he's teaching Talmud there is not necessarily what his father-in-law meant, and that's not what his promise was made about. So he also took upon himself to teach in a local shul that he himself established, called Chevre Shas, and you can understand from the name of the shul that what was the main point of the shul was learning Gemara, and you would give an hour Gemara shiur there every day, in addition to everything that he was doing in the rabbinical seminary, in addition to all of his research and studies that he would publish. So he was a genius of the highest degree, and a very fruitful one. And in a sense, is the embodiment of Torah im Mada. And it's very difficult to think of a more prominent example, because obviously if you take a very different person, let's take Rav Soloveitchik, very known, a giant of Torah. But it's to be very difficult to say that he left mark on the general world. He wrote some things that can be seen as philosophy, but they are heavily Jewish, we may say, and I don't think they carry any weight to this day in the field of philosophy. I may be mistaken, but I think that, so in the end, he was a giant of Torah. I think that's what he wanted to be. And you had other people that may have been Torah scholars, but were giant in science, fine. But someone that left marks, both in the field of Torah, but also in other fields, because the notes of Rav David Tzvi Hoffman are to this day being consulted in some of the learning of Semitic languages, and in what is called today Bible criticism, but was also called back then, meaning not only by Jews, but also by non-Jews. His work was road-breaking, path-breaking? Groundbreaking, thank you. Was groundbreaking and is used to this day. So we both learn him in yeshiva or in the shul, and we can also learn about him in universities. This is very unique. And again, so that makes him an embodiment of this idea. But the question that we would have to speak about already next week is that a way to the many, to the masses? I think they saw it, Rav Itzheimer and him saw his life as an exemplar of Torah im Mada, of what can save Yahadut, Judaism, in the new scientific world. Is that really the solution? That's a question that we would speak about Be'ezrat Hashem next week. So thank you. And again, I'm very excited about renewing this shiur and hope to see you all next week. You can keep them, but if you'd really keep them and bring them next week.
I don't want to promise.
Thank you very much. Toda raba.
You, bye-bye.
Interesting about the exit.